I am very excited to bring you this episode. Our guest is a man named Randall Carlson, and Randall Carlson is a leading voice in what I would call the wisdom pillar of today's world. He is somebody that extensively researches anything that he comes and talks about publicly, and that is no different for today's episode. You can trust that everything that Randall says is not based off of an initial opinion that he had and he stopped there and said, I want to talk about this opinion. No, he is doing extensive research and he is preparing himself with the facts and the information that he feels is necessary and he thinks is necessary to even speak about it in any type of public forum. So in today's podcast, we are talking about the education system. We're talking about the way that our children and ourselves have been indoctrinated into a system that does not facilitate critical thinking and is not based on real life experiences. And it is really designed to push forward a singular narrative or a singular agenda. And we talk about this. We unpack the current education system and we talk about alternative education systems. We talk about his experience in running classes and programs with homeschoolers and the difference between homeschooling, children who are homeschooled and children that have gone through the public education system. And we talk about the education system and its relationship with propaganda and with the media system. It's a very, very deep episode. We cover a lot of ground, and you'll hear it mentioned throughout the podcast that Randall and I have been planning and preparing to launch a more consistent series where we are unpacking historical events and current events and things that we both find compelling and interesting and important to talk about with people from an objective standpoint, not just from presenting opinions, because there's too much of that in the world. So we referenced this a couple of times throughout the podcast, and we will be following up this episode with some more content related to these topics. So with that said, I present to you Titan Podcast Episode 3 with Mr. Randall Carlson. I hope you enjoy. Okay, Mr. Randall Carlson, we're here again. And we are going to be trying to do a successful podcast where we dive into some interesting topics around propaganda, media, and education. So how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing very well. Yeah, we kind of blew it a little bit last time. Because we're still, I think we've pretty much now finally got the studio. I don't know what else we have to do.
Yeah, well, it looks great. We sound great right now.
Yeah.
You've got quite the setup here. A lot of different content coming out of here.
Yeah, and that's the goal, to churn out that content.
Yeah.
So here we are. This is your second time in the studio. You're passing through on the way home. You're coming from a wedding.
Yep.
And we agreed that we would grab an hour and a half here to have a discussion along the lines of what we did before. I mean, it's a shame that we lost it because we certainly covered some interesting territory.
Yeah.
But, I think we've discovered we have a sort of a overlap of our interests, particular in some of the issues and things that are going on today, and so maybe we will talk about that.
Yeah.
And to me, education is very important, and so maybe that would be a topic we could begin
let's
with.
start there. So what do you see happening in the education system in America right now?
Oh, my God. Okay, well...
Easy question to start.
Easy question to start, yes. Well, I hear... talk about we need more money for education. And every time I hear that, and this is primarily coming from the Democratic Party at this point, every time I hear that, I'm like, okay, the more money that the government puts into education, the dumber people are going to get. We've had some discussion about my experience working with the homeschool movement.
Right.
When it was still kind of in its infancy in the 90s, I got recruited to do a program on, quotation marks, air quotes, sacred geometry. I almost sometimes don't even want to use that term anymore because it's kind of become the associations kind of with it, sort of the woo-woo sort of. But
So how would you define sacred geometry then?
Well, sacred geometry was initially the study of the geometry that was applied in ecclesiastical architecture in the Middle Ages, primarily in cathedrals and chapels and abbeys, things like that. Now, of course, the term is much broader. But originally, that was the earliest reference that I've been able to find using the term sacred geometry was in reference primarily to the church architecture of the Middle Ages.
Got it.
Now, of course, you can go from there and you realize that geometry is universal. The principles of geometry are universal, and you don't have to be part of one culture, one civilization or another to know, for example, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Mm-hmm. You can figure that out, if you, and so I came at it from a building standpoint. When early 70s, my two brothers, Rowan and Rocky, and myself, we were recruited to be carpenters on 2 dome building projects up in the north woods of Minnesota. I showed you a picture earlier of the Swami we had studied with. Mm-hmm. And we were doing a week-long retreat in Minnesota, and there was an architect in the group that designed a couple of these Buckminster Fuller domes. Are you familiar with Buckminster Fuller?
I don't think so.
Okay, so I'm going to be educating you about Buckminster Fuller. Yeah, you can see I've got several of his books right up there. I got 3 of them. You see Synergetics 2, the white book.
Yeah.
So he wrote those 3, Critical Path and Synergetics 1. So he invented the so-called geodesic dome. A lot of people built geodesic domes back in the late 60s and early 70s as part of the counterculture movement, but they turned out to be very impractical, primarily because it was hard to keep them from leaking. They may be undergoing somewhat of a revival now because new technologies have made it easier to build domes that don't leak. Mm. But so we were building 2 of these geodesic domes up in the woods, and it was some challenging geometry to figure out because it's all based on interconnected triangles. So it required some geometry and a little bit of trig and reading tables of angle cuts and all of this. And then we built these 2 domes. One of them was called the Bindu Dome, and it had a spire at the top because it was inspired by the geometry of an Islamic mosque. Okay, so there was a publication called Shelter that came out about a year later, came out in 73, large format, and it was essentially about vernacular architecture and the way different peoples, different cultures, different societies through history had interfaced with the environment through architecture. And it could be anything from as simple as a yurt all the way up to a Gothic cathedral and everything in between. So that publication gave a whole page treatment to this Bindu dome that we had built. Rowan was lead carpenter on it, and so once that came out, of course, I procured a copy because we were part of that building crew that built that thing. But there was a lot of other information in there that I found extremely fascinating, and this was, I think, the first place I ever encountered the term sacred geometry in reference to the geometry that was being used in Islamic mosques. Mm-hmm. And it talked about, there was a certain, I don't remember the name of it, there was a certain temple, and it said that because of the specific geometry and arrangement of materials and proportions and so on, anybody who walked into it would immediately burst out crying. And I thought, well, that's interesting. How does that work? So that's kind of what led me into the study of geometry.
So you were exposed naturally through the work that you were doing. You weren't looking for sacred geometry.
Correct, yeah.
So through a self-education path is how you came across it.
Pretty much, yes. And this is 1973. Now, there's not a whole lot available on the subject in 1973. So I used this as a resource. It was the first place that I learned about the golden section, or also called the divine proportion and so on, and how it had been used in architecture. And shortly thereafter, I discovered the work of several other people that had written books. There wasn't a whole lot. It took me several years to track down several of the books that I now have in my collection. One of them is a really interesting 2-volume set, and it's focused mainly on cathedral geometry, but then it shows how some of the geometry that was being used to design and build cathedrals was also being used to build Greek temples, and Romans were using it. And that's when I began to appreciate that it was much broader than simply ecclesiastical architecture of the Middle Ages. And then I discovered the work of John Michel, who was a British author and researcher who mostly it was 2 books. One was called The View Over Atlantis, and the other one was called City of Revelation. And so I was, like when we were talking over lunch, I mentioned to you that I used to, like, out of high school, I would go hang out at this bookstore that was in downtown Minneapolis, and it was like one of the largest occult bookstores in the U.S. at the time. So I was just devouring everything and wanted to know everything. So that's where I learned about Freemasonry. I learned about Kabbalah in there. Discovered, several of the books I have here on Kabbalah. There's a component of Kabbalistic studies that is also built around geometry, and this particular diagram, the Tree of Life, as it's called.
Yeah.
So I just started absorbing stuff, and all through the 70s was just obsessively fascinated with this, and then discovered how, some of the works treated how geometry was found throughout the natural order of things in living systems, all of this. So it just expanded from there. I did my first lecture or presentation. I was living, I think it was about 1978 or 79. I was living in some old townhomes, and one of my neighbors was an architect from India. And somehow we got to talking, and he started telling me about Indian traditions of geometry, using in the stupas and temples and things in India. And then he asked me if I would do a presentation to a group, and I had never done that before, but I said sure I would. And then so he got a group of his architect friends and so forth. We met in his living room, and I put together a slideshow with an old-fashioned slide projector and all of that. And we had a lot of fun doing it, and these people were very interested. I was, God, what was I, like in my early 20s, and most of these guys were, 30s, 40s, even older. And then I did another lecture in 1980, and then I got requested, could I do a whole class? Now, in the 70s, I took courses in engineering, graphics, and design, and drafting, and so on. So I had learned how to draw. I'd learned how to do geometric drawing. So I put together this course where I took people starting with the very simplest geometric operations and going progressively more complex. I think that was 1980. And then for the next 10 years, I did this on a regular basis in addition to our regular job. Rowan got here in the early 80s, and we formed our first company. And, always enjoyed figuring out how to build things.
Yeah.
Figure out how to use the geometry. And then on my own, I studied trigonometry. And about the mid-90s, I had given a lecture to a group of dowsers. Do you know what dowsing is?
I don't.
Okay, so you need to know about this. You ever heard the term water witching?
Water witching.
Well, this goes back. Okay, so this is a skill. A lot of skeptical scientific types don't believe in it, but I've seen it work, so I know it works. But it's a way of detecting water flowing underground. But it's also can be used to detect ore deposits, minerals. Probably one of the very first, in the old days, what I remember is seeing pictures of these guys, and they would have a hickory switch, like a branch with, a main branch with 2 stems on it, and they would hold that, and they could walk around. They could detect water flowing underground. So I had, in 1975, I believe it was, I was building me and my other brother, Rocky, we were building a boat barn out of telephone poles, and we had 3 rows of 15 poles that we were the owner had gotten telephone poles from somewhere, and we wanted to, he came and asked us, can we build something out of these telephone poles? And he said, it was right on the Chattahoochee River, and so he had these boats, and he wanted a barn for his boats. So what we did was 15 telephone poles in 3 rows of 5 each. So we called Ma Bell, who was the telephone company back then, and they had a deal where for $8 a pole, they would come out with their auger truck, drill a hole, use their boom, and set the poles for you. $8 a pole. That was a pretty good deal. So we called them up. I, meanwhile, went out and laid out where the barn was going to go and drove a stake every place I wanted a telephone pole to be set. The Ma Bell truck pulls up, with the big boom on the back, double crew cab, parks up on the road, and then this older guy gets out, tall, skinny guy, wearing overalls, right, with an old crumpled hat on, carrying what looked like a violin case. And I thought, what has he got? What is this here? He's got a machine gun in there or what, And then you saw the other 2 guys up in the cab. They were wearing the uniforms of the telephone company and all of that. So me and Rocky stopped working, and I'm just watching. What's this guy doing? And he walks down with this violin-looking case, stops and opens it up, and he takes out, and they were 2 swing rods. Now, swing rods is one of the things that dowsers will use to detect water underground. And basically what he had was these old-fashioned automobile antennas, the telescoping kind, and he got a little ball on the end, right?
Yep.
So what he did is you pull it out and then bend it at 90 degrees and saw it off, so you got about 6 inches of the outer sleeve that you can hold, and then the upper part of it is free to just oscillate, swing back and forth.
Yep.
So he went one by one around over each of these stakes that we had driven in the ground, and when he would walk over it, there would be no response. The rods are just swinging gently back and forth. He would go over each stake, and he would holler up to the guys at the truck, "Clear." So all 15 of them were clear, which meant that there was nothing, no obstruction, no water mains, pipes, or anything under the ground. So I was pretty impressed about that, because I thought, okay, so the telephone company is going to come out, and they're going to drill. And they're drilling based upon this guy's ability to detect whether there's any encroachment or anything. So I knew then that it was a gravel road out front, and I knew that the water main came in somewhere to the house. I didn't know exactly where. I knew it crossed the driveway, but I didn't really know where. So after he clears all of the 15 stakes, he's got his swing rods, and he starts walking across the driveway. He gets about halfway across, and I'm watching the whole time, still not entirely convinced that, okay, these guys are playing a joke on me or something,
Yeah.
So he walks across the center of the driveway, and it was like all of a sudden it looked like the 2 swing rods that are just going like this, all of a sudden they cross into an X. And they literally bend like they were under tension. You could see them. They almost like bent, like somebody, an invisible man, had grabbed the end of them.
Pulling them down, yeah.
Yeah, and he's holding them. And then as he keeps walking, he steps across a couple of steps. And it's like they go back to their oscillating gently. So then what he did was he walked in a zigzag fashion. And every time he crossed, and we confirmed, the owner came out after a while, and we confirmed, yeah, here's exactly where the water main comes in. But every time he would cross, you could see the swing rods, and just, so he was able to trace out the water main. And then excuse me, I was standing there looking at it, and he goes, "You want to try it?" And I was immediately self-conscious. But I said, "Sure."
Don't you just have to hold them?
Just had to hold them. And, I'm walking, and when I walked across that, I literally felt like somebody grabbed the ends of them. And it did that for me. They crossed, and then they did this. And I could feel it as plain as anything. Now, I've tried and experimented since then, number of times, never had that kind of response. recently I was talking to somebody who was familiar with the whole thing. He said, okay, well, there was two things going on there. One is they call it the first timer effect.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what the psychological or emotional or whatever that component is, but he said there is such a thing. It's called the first timer effect. And the other was, I forget, not associative, but he said there was two things working for you there. One, it was you were the first timer, and the second one was the associative effect because the guy was right there.
Yeah.
So it was those two things that were sort of working in tandem that you got such a strong response, because I've never gotten anything like that even remotely since. Well, what that did, to make a long story short, is it convinced me, okay, there's a whole invisible world. And subsequent, what I've learned in the ensuing years is that it's, now, well, and then I had a conversation with somebody who was in Vietnam, and this is well known, particularly the Marines. They had dowsing experts in Vietnam who had the skill, and they would use to find underground tunnels, landmines, things like that.
Yeah.
You can actually look up, put Vietnam Marines dowsing, and you can actually see pictures of Marines out there in the field. So I was told about that by somebody who'd been a Marine. That because I was telling him a story I just told you, and he said, yeah, we used to do that in Nam.
What is the effect that is creating the tension on those?
That's a good question. I don't really know, other than the fact that it's probably, I think it has to do with geomagnetism. And the water moving underground. Now, there's a whole realm of discussion we can get into that will be beyond the scope of what we can talk about today. But if we do some remote things like we're talking about, we can dive into some of all of this. But again, it's this idea that there are fields of energy all around us, and they're subjected to things, and particularly water moving under pressure through bedrock can cause detectable changes in the geomagnetic field. We know that from instrumentation. There's clearly a subjective proponent to the whole dowsing phenomena, and that's what I learned, because my first experience with it was very convincing. Seeing it happen and experiencing it myself convinced me absolutely this is real. Now, I've heard a lot of stories about, people going to go out there, they've got some skeptical scientists, and they're going, okay, we want to test you, get out. And the results are no. And it's almost like the reverse of the associative. In other words, my response was amplified by the presence of this guy who had been doing this for years and years and years. Now, if you get somebody who's a disbeliever and they go, this is all bullshit, whatever, perhaps it has the opposite effect. But since then, I've known many dowsers that use it for various things. Later, I learned about map dowsing, where you can actually take a pendulum over a map and locate things. I haven't had a lot of experience with that, but I know it's a thing, and I know people that swear by it. So anyways, come about the when would this have been? About 94, 93, 94.
That was when you saw this effect happen?
No, that was maybe 1975.
1975. So you were exposed. This was a strong example exposing you to the invisible world.
Yes.
That started your research into sacred geometry.
Well, it paralleled. It paralleled. Then once I got into reading like John Michel, he kind of brought these two things together. And one of the things is that, and I discovered that this is very universal. Like now, a dowser uses instruments, but, dowsers talk about, back in the time when you had generation after generation living very close to nature, you had people who could detect these changes in the ambient fields even without instrumentation. They could just detect using their hands. So typically you'll see in a lot of Egyptian hieroglyphs and stuff, you will see gods and others holding their hands in certain ways. And the idea there is that by doing certain rituals or things, you can actually amplify and change your consciousness and detect changes in the energy fields around you. Now, we know that, for example, the moon's orbit around the Earth causes the tidal effect. Well, so as the oceans can rise and fall with the tides, there's as much water, groundwater, basically, is in the oceans. So there are tides within the groundwater, right? Now, one of the things we know from studying and looking at ancient builders and architecture and so forth, monumental architecture, sacred architecture and stuff, is the ubiquitous presence of lunar orientation. We can look at the Newark monumental earthworks up in Ohio. The entire 18.6 year cycle, lunar cycle, is embedded in the orientation and the disposition of the elements and the composition of that whole monumental earthwork structure. So that if you know the points at which, the vantage points at which to place yourself, you can look at through these. It's one, there's a flattened octagon, there's a big circle, there's causeways. If you know where to place yourself, you can now track with high degree of precision the position of the moon through its 18.6 year cycle, which is very subtle. If you want to think of it this way, if you're watching where the moon rises and sets on the horizon, imagine it over a period of time, it does this, shifts to the south, shifts to the north, and then it does a cycle like this, essentially. Minimum rise, minimum set, maximum rise, maximum set. And it goes through this oscillation like this. Right? To go through the full cycle takes 18.6 years. Why would ancient hunter-gatherers, foragers, even subsistence farmers, why would they bother to build structures out of megalithic stones or, millions of tons of earth to embody that motion? To me, that was always, as a builder, I knew, oh gosh, I know how much work it is if we're going to put a 1,000-pound I-beam up, right? Yeah. Why would you build something out of 20-ton stones, in your spare time? If you're a hunter-gatherer, you're a nomadic forager, but in your spare time you're quarrying 20-ton stones and transporting them and building things out of it, why would you do that? Well, you could assume that maybe there's some weird culture somewhere that for whatever reason is obsessed with this and they decide to do it. Okay, well, you'd say, well, they're the idiosyncratic example. But then the problem is you've got cultures from all over the world doing this. So that just doesn't make sense to me, because if you look at modern architecture, we build out of stone.
Yeah.
But typically the stones, might be 100, 200 pounds. We're not building out of 40-ton stones. Why? Well, it'd be completely uneconomical to do so. Well, if it's uneconomical for us to build with 20-ton, 50-ton and up stones using our modern technology, it's going to be 1,000 times more uneconomical for hunter-gatherers. That's why it just struck me as, how do the academic types so willing to accept these superficial explanations? Like, doesn't this raise questions in your mind? I mean, because it certainly does in my mind. But so coming forward to the mid-1990s, I'd already been teaching a bunch of given lectures and classes and things on geometry, sacred geometry, and I ran into a friend of mine that was he was involved with the homeschool movement in Atlanta, and he says, "Are you still doing those classes and things on sacred geometry?" And I said, "Yeah. I haven't been doing it lately. I've been too busy." He says, "Well, would you consider coming in and doing a 2-week geometry program for this homeschool group that I've got?" And I had time, some spare time. I said, yeah, I can do that. I'll try that. That sounds like fun. This was in a March, I think, of 1995. Okay, so I went in, and what he had done is he had gotten with a group of parents whose children had gone through the Waldorf system of education. And at the time in Atlanta, Waldorf did not go beyond 8th grade.
Okay.
Now, you may know about Waldorf. You've got, the way they do it is when you're in whatever, like kindergarten age or first grade, when you're starting out, you have a teacher. And that teacher stays with you right up into at least middle school or high school. So obviously, when you have one teacher like that, he or she gets to know the students very well, knows what their aptitudes are, what their deficiencies are, what their interests are. Mm-hmm. It's just a whole different approach. So in Atlanta, the Waldorf system topped out at 8th grade. So they had launched the Waldorf school 8 years before. Mm-hmm. So now they had this graduating group, and they were trying to decide what to do with them. And do they send them to public school? Do they send them to private school? So a group of parents got together, and they started a league. I forget what they call it, but it was a homeschool organization. And they hired this friend of mine, Bradley Riley, to be a main lesson instructor. They rented a couple of rooms in a church that had the space, turned them into classrooms, and then Brad Riley, he would be the main lesson teacher, but he would bring in, like, I guess you could call them subcontractors or specialists to teach about different things. So he asked me if I would come in and do a geometry program.
That's awesome.
So I came in, and what I did was I kind of made it a combination geometry and art, because it was all drawing, because I believe that's the way you learn geometry. When I took geometry in 8th grade, middle school, it was so boring. All it was proofs and definitions. But then I realized there's this whole other side to it, the drawing side. Using a straight edge and a compass. By this time, I had learned all of that. And so I set up a program for 2 weeks. I think we met maybe 4 sessions twice a week for 2 hours. And the 2 weeks was up, and I had the kids drawing, and, I had them bring in color pencils and coloring so you could see all the different forms and shapes and how they interconnected. And the 2 weeks was up, and then, I don't know, a few days to a week or something went by, and then I get a call from Brad, and he says, well, the kids were wondering if you could come back and do some more. They really liked it.
Yeah.
So, okay, yeah, I can do that. I got time. So I went back and did 2 more weeks, and then that was up. Same thing happened. So I ended up finishing the school year, right up to Memorial Day or whatever. So I ended up doing like 6 weeks. And it was a lot of fun. And then summer break comes, and then over the summer I started getting phone calls because the word was getting out amongst these parents. So that I came in and done this geometry program with these kids, and they had so much fun. So now parents started calling me and going, well, my son is, he was in middle school, and he just thinks he failed at math, and, I thought maybe your class might help him. I started getting calls like that. So turned out for the next 15 years, turned into a 15-year
Wow.
sideline gig, organizing classes with homeschool kids. I expanded it. I probably had over 120 kids come through there. One year I was doing kind of a science-related class, and we had 3 boys, and one of the boys had a, don't remember his condition, but he had been administered a lot of steroids and stuff, and his growth, he didn't grow to full height, but he was a brilliant kid named Mark. Really loved the kid, and he had been to the hospital several times. And one day he's in class talking about his trips to the hospital, and he said that the worst thing about it was when he was being transported to the hospital on the gurney, and it was so bumpy and stuff. And I guess he had like growth issues like with his bones and stuff. So Anyways, he came up with this concept. He studied these air-supported trains in Japan.
Yeah.
And we built this model of this thing. There was a hospital gurney that was based on the same principles. We entered a national science fair contest with 1,500 teams, and we got second place nationally. Yeah. But what I would do, like Rowan is out in the field, he's building these projects, and we would be looking at, having a lesson in class on, the properties of the right triangle and what I called the builder's triangle, which was the 3, 4, 5 triangle, or we would be looking at talking about trigonometry or whatever. I would bring the kids to the job sites and show them, okay, now, do you remember we were talking about the tangent function? When we come out here on the job site, you can talk to any carpenter and you ask them what's rise over run. And I would show them the framing square and how we used it. And so the rise over run, if you want to know, like if you're going to have a stairway, you want to have a rise. How much is the rise from this floor to the next floor? And the run, how much horizontal, right? Now, you don't want it too steep. You don't want it too shallow. You want it to be just right. So I said, now remember we talked in class about the tangent function. Well, that's exactly the same thing as rise over run. So let's go back to the classroom and design a stairway, or let's go back to the classroom and use these principles of trigonometry to design this roof, right? So then you would do that, and the kids could immediately see the connection between what we're learning in the classroom
and a real-world application.
And a real-world application, exactly. So that was when I began to really think about, a different approach to education than the factory model.
How would you describe the factory model of education?
Oh, it's pathetic. I mean, it doesn't educate. Think about how many kids go through the system and come out not knowing anything. I mean, it's a total failure. It doesn't work. And we've got so many other options at our disposal that we could have, if the government was not monopolizing education. I mean, the Department of Education consumes like over $100 billion a year. And I would see what these homeschool families were able to do for literally for a few $1,000s a year, right? And turn out kids that are better educated, more excited about learning. There were so many...
And with practical applications that they can go out into the world with, whether that's in a market, in the workforce, or creating their own business or working for somebody.
Absolutely. And creating their own business. I mean, yes, I'm totally a huge advocate of that. And, I mean, I think that, the dumbing... The more money you pour into the existing monopolistic system, the dumber students are going to get. I think it's throw $100 billion more, and you're going to get the scholastic standards are going to drop by 50%. Because what we see, and we've had this conversation, you know this well now. I think that the primary function of government-run education now is not education, it's indoctrination. And what we see now is kids getting spoon-fed all of this stuff, all of these agendas that have been introduced within the last 10 years. And as these agendas are being forced into the schools, we see the scholastic standards going down.
Yeah.
Why? Because you're not spending the time talking about the things that people need to talk about. There are these roving interviewers that will go around and talk to people, young people, and I'm sure that they're maybe the extreme example. But how does somebody go through 12 years of school and not know who fought who in the Civil War, or who fought who was the Revolutionary War was between America and who, and how do you not know that?
Or be able to name 10 countries.
Yeah, be able to name 10 countries. Name 2 countries that border the U.S. I mean, and they stand there and don't know. How is that even possible? Because it's the system, and I think it's deliberate. It's a deliberate dumbing down. And one of the most critically important things that needs to happen from here on out is that monopoly needs to be broken. And I've always believed, even since I came out, I was by no means, displayed scholarly aptitude, except fleeting flashes of it.
Yeah.
Okay. I was just so bored. I mean, to me, everything was boring that I was there. And here's the thing, this is the difference. Okay. So we would have 2-hour slot in my classes that I would organize for the homeschoolers. We'd come in and I would usually let the first 15 minutes just hanging out and being social with the kids. Like, wow, what'd you guys do this weekend? Oh, you went to so-and-so. Hey, that's an awesome place. And, we should talk about that. And getting into that kind of thing, one of the outgrowths of that was that I began to do some, field trips, geologically oriented field trips, taking the kids out and doing things like measuring stream flow, calculating peak discharges after, let's say, there'd been a heavy rainfall.
Yeah.
And
so you're taking the time to build a relationship with the students to
Yep.
then understand what is interesting to them or what they have they've experienced to create a parallel learning process for them with that.
Yes, and one of the other things that I early on realized was advantageous to everybody concerned was the classroom was bigger than my studio here. So, if you've got 6 to 10 kids sitting at tables, there's still plenty of room.
Yeah.
These were church rooms. My policy was this. If you come in and you pay, and I was only charging $10 an hour, which, tutoring at that time was $50, $60 an hour.
Wow.
But that's somebody walking into your house, sitting down one-on-one with the student, right? Well, now, if you've got 6 or 8 kids in the class and $10 an hour, it was a really good deal for them. But it also,
You got paid well.
I got
so
paid.
You were incentivized in
Yeah.
a way that didn't make yourself have to worry about getting the most out of it for
exactly.
you.
Exactly. So one of the things, my policy became that, okay, as long as there's room, and there was always room, I never had to turn. I said, if you come in with your kids, parents are encouraged to participate, and it's free. You pay for your kid, you come in and hang out. Because I quickly found out that the parents actually, several dynamics that I observed. One was that the parents, there sort of became almost like somewhat competitive between the kids and their parents. I'd say, okay, now we're going to talk about deriving the quadratic formula, right? And the kids are down there studiously, and the parents, and then pretty soon, the 13-year-old is, come on, Dad, this is how you do it, and it had this, it kind of flipped the relationship a little bit, but it was really, everybody enjoyed that. And if the classes were a little bigger, I discovered 6 to 8 was really almost like the cutoff. Because 6 to 8, you could still keep up with where everybody was at. You could kind of keep order. A couple of times I had 10, 11 kids, and I noticed there was kind of a line that you would cross where sort of the disorder went up a notch. It became a little bit harder to ascertain where everyone was at, what their level, who was getting it, who was not getting it, and so on. But when I had a couple of parents in the class,
That all goes away.
yeah, that all goes away. They would help keep the order, and there was a couple of times where I had the student, the mom, and the grandmom in the class, all coloring away, and how did you do on the quiz, and comparing notes, and that was one of the things that I really did begin to appreciate was the relationship between kids that were being homeschooled and their parents and their families. It was just, it was a very discernible difference. We went on, and Rowan, the engineer, is over there. Rowan, you remember when we were up there hiking and we stopped at that park and there was a group of kids putting on a play?
Yeah.
And then Jesse came in and sat down and was watching, and they warmly invited him up to get involved and all of that. And then we drove on down into the park further, and then you made the comment, I bet they were homeschool kids. Just because of yeah, you remember that? Yeah, so then driving back out, we stop and I get out and I go talking to him. I says, are you guys homeschooled by any chance? Oh yeah, we're part of this homeschool group and yeah, we're up here. We've written this play. We're putting on this play. We're rehearsing this play that we wrote. And so the homeschool group, you know, they're making the costumes. They have some kids that played music. You know, they wrote the play.
Yeah.
So it's like within that they encompass like 3 or 4 different fields of learning.
Yeah.
And the thing that really struck both Rowan and I and Julie was how warmly they were accepting of Jesse. Mm-hmm. You know, Jesse, our son, is he's handicapped, but it was like that was not even an issue. They were so welcoming to him, and their whole demeanor and attitude is what led Rowan to go, God, I wonder if those kids are being homeschooled.
Yeah. And
sure enough, they were, and it's very subtle. It's subtle, but once you've been around, you see the difference. The not filled with, you know, the kind of angst and the attitudes and things that you see so much that to me is a direct byproduct of the whole system of education that's being imposed upon this country right now.
Yeah.
And you think about it. You go in there and you got, 50 to 55 minutes. You just have time to start getting into something, and then the bell rings. It's all bell. You have to get up and you march to the next class. You've got 4 or 5 different teachers. They've got 4 or 5 different student groups. You don't get to know them. They don't get to know you. You know, you could start, when you start deconstructing the system of education in this country now, you begin to realize how utterly deficient and counterproductive it really is.
Yes, and you're not learning information that is applicable anywhere outside of that classroom in your life at that time. So you go into a classroom, you learn without any personal connection to the person who's teaching you, distracted by other students, and then you walk away, and the only application that you have of that information is generally on a piece of paper that they're calling your homework.
Yeah.
Just spend 8 hours here doing all these things, and then go home and spend 4 or 5 more hours, and then never use it for at least the next 10 years.
Yes, and it's to me it's just an obsolete system, but it's now being maintained because it's about the whole social and political dynamic in America. And when I hear like and listen, I'm equally as critical of both sides of the political spectrum as it is right now, but since we're talking about education and big proponents of education, and I'm going to put air quotes, is the liberal side, the Democrats primarily, one of their things, we need more money for public education. And I'm like, no, we don't. Because here's what I believe. I believe that if you had a free market in education that didn't rely on compulsory attendance laws, didn't rely on being funded by compulsory taxation. Like, for example, here, a big part of probably half of our property taxes goes to pay for public education. You know, and obviously, you know, we don't have children in public school, not anymore. Jesse went for a while, and that's their whole other stories there. Sometimes it went great, and sometimes it was not great. There was one episode where he was being abused by a teacher's aide, and we knew that because he came home one time, a couple of times and he had these bruises on his arm, and like I'm looking at him one time, and there's like 4 of them, and then there's another bruise on the other side,
like a handprint.
Yeah, like somebody and so we pulled him out of that school. That was it. Pulled him out of there. No, you're not gonna, little boy with Down syndrome. No, you're not gonna do that. And I think that aide got fired. But
another issue in and of itself, a lack of somebody looking out for children. If there is somebody in a place of power who, I mean, talking about the people who are educating kids, the teachers' aides, you're not getting the highest caliber of person in that position because of a multitude of different things, but one being the incentives around being a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
The best teachers that I've had in my life in high school or middle school were people who just loved the subject.
Yeah.
And I remember one teacher specifically, she taught Latin. I think her name was Mrs. Guy, and she loved Latin so much. And she would show up to class with a lot of energy, with a lot of passion to explain to you what will this mean in your life?
Mm-hmm.
What will this in the future, if you want to be in the medical system, if you want to be a doctor, if you want to research things that have a historical language, written in the historical language of Latin, then this is what opens the door to it. And she was just so excited about that. But she was not incentivized to do that. It wasn't because she said, you know what, I want to go here and have my life be taken care of. Mm-hmm. It was, I want to go here and I want to have a fun time with this subject that I enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
And then most of the other teachers were struggling for money,
mm-hmm.
struggling for time, in an environment where the kids are abusive to them and they want control back. So it's just not a situation where the people who are educating our youth are people who really even are empowered to do it. Mm-hmm. They're just consistently disempowered, even if they started from a good place.
And one of the other, to me, byproducts of that whole system is bullyism. And we know that it's rampant. Bullies, children that are being bullied incessantly oftentimes kill themselves. I mean, that's how serious it can actually be. But again, that is part of the consequence of the artificial stratification. Like when I was doing classes, there was one year, the youngest kid in the class was 9, the oldest was 17. And I quickly found out that there would be a dynamic where the older kids just almost naturally started helping the younger kids. And I never saw anything even remotely like bullyism in that.
Homeschooling environment?
In the homeschooling environment, yeah. Now, you go to, again, government schools, and it's artificially stratified by age, which to me is completely artificial.
Your peer group is as you get older and as you get more mature, you realize that your peer group expands.
Yeah.
When the entire idea is age, in high school specifically, in middle school, is a hierarchy based on age.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay.
And if you've got somebody like, I'll give an example. In several cases, I had kids come in at 10, 11 and drop out. And their parents would be all distraught, and I would say, don't worry about it. Kids will have different aptitudes, at different ages. See, here's the thing. If somebody is not ready to start thinking on that level of abstraction where you can get into mathematics, you try to force it on them, and then you're going to get this thing that I heard over and over again, even in my adult classes. It was, well, I just don't get math. I can't do math. And I would say, yes, you can. Here's the problem. You go into a class where there's a structured curriculum, and you have to get A, B, and C by the first quarter. Well, the teacher does not have time to stop. Either you're going to be more intelligent than the mean or less intelligent. If you're more intelligent, you're going to sit there bored half the time, like I was all the time, or you're not going to be able to follow it. But I discovered, well, hey, here's the thing. If you just take it step by step, and for me, when I discovered that, there would be different rates of learning, the kids that would get it first, I would get them to help the other kids. Jack, would you help Eddie over here? Oh, sure. And then, they feel it's almost like their own self-esteem gets, sure, yeah, I can. And then they're doing it. And instead of the older kid bullying the younger kid, they're actually mentoring them.
They're helping
right?
them.
Now, you look at this, again, the artificial stratification. So if you do not get math and whatever, you fail a couple of classes, they're now going to hold you back, right? So immediately now there is a stigma that goes with that. And I definitely remember from middle school, the worst bullies were always the kids that had been held back a year or two. And particularly in middle school, think about it. The difference between a typical 12 or 13-year-old and a 14 or 15-year-old can be pretty pronounced.
Right.
And they're already feeling insecure and inferior because they've now been held back, right? And they're usually have other issues and stuff, but typically the bullies, in my experience back then, was that they were almost always, like every time I got bullied, it was some older kid that had been held back a year or two. You know, I think about one of the sort of maybe an analog, and in the homeschool group, a number of the students that I had were in scouting. And I had a couple that went through and became Eagle Scouts. And I went to several scouting functions and award ceremonies and things like this. And I noticed that in scouting, let me shout it to you, with the Cub Scouts, and you had the wolf, and you had the bear and the lion, I think, and then you get into the higher levels. Ultimately, you become an Eagle Scout, right? But I noticed in there that you didn't have this age segregation. Mm-hmm. And you had kids of, now my experience was with boys, but you had boys of the whole spectrum from adolescence up to young adulthood. And I noticed that the young adults who were like the scout leaders and stuff, they were just high quality young men. And they became the role models for the younger kids, right? And there was this dynamic where you didn't have this stratification where you looked to your own level for verification, for validation. Mm-hmm. You looked to the level above you.
Right.
And if they were doing the same thing, and you had this natural or organic hierarchy where you didn't have gangsters at the top, you had high quality achievers who were setting examples. And this is the value system that worked its way down through the ranks. And I really did notice that with scouting. And I thought, that's what we need in education.
That's what we need in most of our institutions in general.
Yes.
When we're looking for leaders, we would like them to be based off of merit. And some type of holding yourself to a value system, not how scary can you be or how abusive can you be or manipulative.
Right. And, coming up in our generation, I was born almost 1 year from the middle of the 20th century. And, you don't notice so much from year to year, but when you start looking at the evolution of society, let's say in 10-year jumps, you really begin to see the changes. Now, there was bad stuff going on when we were kids. There was a lot of racism. There was segregation, which I'm so glad is over because we've got so many high-quality friends, multiracial, across the spectrum. And I really enjoy hanging out with people who aren't the same. Now, of course, we're a mix. A lot of us in America are a mix.
Right.
Our dad was 100% Swede, the son of Swedish immigrants, but our mom was a mix of things that included a lot of French, possibly even a little. It's rumored that her dad had some Jewish, Cherokee Indian, Black Dutch. So from her, there was a whole lot of Scottish. So there was a whole mix that came from her side. But where we grew up in Minnesota, rural Minnesota, it was pretty much Swedes, Norwegians, and Germans were the dominant, Northwestern Europeans that settled in that area.
Right.
So we grew up in an area that in an environment that was very segregated, not by any kind of mandate or imposition, but just because it was almost all But we had Asians in our school, and we had, that I recall in my high school, it was 1,500, 2,000 people. There were only two black students that I remember. I don't remember much about the girl, but the boy, He was very popular. He was a scholar. He was an athlete. He was on the student council. And I noticed that, maybe first day of school, oh, there's a black person. 2 weeks in, you don't even notice that anymore. You just don't even notice it. Or like, Takata that was in my gym class, he was Asian. First, he's different. He's 2 weeks into school, though, you don't even notice that anymore. And that was one of the bad things, I think, about that era. Although I did learn some interesting things later on when I went to we were over lunch, we were talking about Prince Hall Masonry.
Right.
And I went to a Prince Hall Masonic function about 20 years ago by invitation, somebody that Julie, my wife, worked with. And he was a younger Mason, and he was very much looking forward to the white Masons and the black Masons integrating, because the core tradition of Freemasonry is brotherhood, right? So how do you have brotherhood? But I went to this function, and I learned something, that the older Prince Hall Masons were not interested in integrating. Well, like I mentioned, Prince Hall was a Revolutionary War hero. They have this multi-century pedigree. They were very proud of it. And we're fine. We don't need to integrate. We're proud of our black Freemasonry. Now, what's happened is, now this really began 25 years ago. Lodges, particularly in the Northeast and in the West, began to integrate. Georgia and southern states were, of course, the last. But finally, the last 3 or 4 years, we've got now black Masons and white Masons are sitting in lodge together, and I celebrate that. And Georgia Masonry is integrated, Tennessee Masonry is integrated, and the interesting thing about it to me was that it came about naturally and organically. It was not imposed by force or by mandate. And, we can go back and we can look at civil rights and we can say, well, the races wouldn't have become integrated without the federal involvement. I'm not convinced, because we can go back to the 50s when we grew up, the music that I'm listening to when we're kids, half of it was black. I still to this day love doo-wop. And doo-wop was black singers on the corners, street corners, harmonizing. The rhythm and blues, some of my favorite groups, the Four Tops. I love the Drifters, right? And you after a while, you don't even think anymore, oh, the Drifters, they're all black, right? You don't even think that. You love the music, and you can look in entertainment, culture, sports. It was already becoming integrated,
right,
naturally, without being forced. Now, maybe it would have taken an extra 10 years, but I think it would have been a whole lot smoother transition.
In general, people at their core want the same things.
Yes.
And they have their own process of getting there. But sort of what we're seeing what we are seeing in the education system, I think, is a product of the influence of who has money and power, and where do they want this agenda to go? Where do they want these systems to go to serve their agenda? So, for example, with desegregating, that was a movement because, like you said, it was federally mandated. There was laws passed to say, okay, we will desegregate, which at that time was beneficial for the world. It was something that needed to happen, and the powers that be pushed it in that direction. Well, the same sort of thing is happening in the education system, not for the better, though. It is the indoctrination needs to be furthered, so let's use our influence and our resources to further that for the sake of whatever they want to happen to be manifested through the education system.
Yeah. And again, speaking about the changes in the evolution of society now, I came of age. I was in high school during the peak of the Vietnam War. I graduated in '69, which was the peak year. I had to register for the draft. My year was, you ever heard of the lottery? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you turn on the TV and they'd be sitting there and they would have this machine, and would just like your playing, some game or something. You're playing the lottery game or, and the ping pong ball would pop up and they'd grab it and it would have a date on it, right? So they would say, okay, February 2nd. Next one would come up August 17th, right? So the first 120 that came up, you were Vietnam bound. Definitely you were going, right?
If you got drafted on that date?
No, that was your birthday. So if you were born on August 17th, and it was one of the first 120 or 125 numbers that came up out of 365 of the year, you were going to Vietnam. You were going to get drafted. You were going to get sent to. You were going to be given an M16 and sent to Vietnam to kill or be killed. Mm-hmm. If you were in the upper echelon of 120, you weren't going, right? If you were in the middle, it could go 50-50. I don't remember exactly how that was partitioned, but I remember sitting there watching on the television that night when they're drawing up the numbers, and it got up to, maybe it was 125, because it seemed to me, and this is more than half a century ago, I'm thinking we're getting up to almost, if we can get to 125, they haven't called my number, March 26th, my birth date. Hey, I'm maybe not going to have to go. And by this time, I didn't want to go. I had people that I knew had come back from there, and, and what I'd seen, and of course we had a much freer media back then, so you could see on television what was actually happening. Right? So I'm within like 3 or 4 of the cutoff line, and then March 26th comes up. So I thought, well, I'm Vietnam bound unless I, go to college and get a college deferment or go to Canada. A lot of draft resistors were going to Canada back then. It's a long story. I've told it, and I won't get into it now, but I got busted by some plainclothes cops, and one of them planted a joint on me, and then his partner busted me. And I was enmeshed in the legal system when I got called up for the draft.
Ah.
And that was the main factor, I think, that put me in the 1Y category.
Gotcha.
Which meant suitable for military service only in times of national emergency, which was interpreted back then as like if we actually got invaded. Right. So it was just a weird, turn of circumstances. I didn't go. Within a couple of years, they were bringing the troops home. Nixon came in, was elected in 1968, peace with honor, but as many people died during Nixon's 5 years before he got ousted, as had already died. So if he had pulled us out immediately, 25,000 young American soldiers would have lived, and probably another 50,000 who were wounded, either physically or mentally or psychologically. A lot of suicides, and we're just figuring out back then, about PTSD. And so Vietnam was over. I didn't go because of that fluke, but I mentioned that media was a lot more freer, and journalists were not embedded. They were free to go about photograph, report, and there are some striking photographs from Vietnam, right? Well, of course, after that, the government decided that, we've got to now control the narrative, and we cannot, like, for example, right now, no international journalists are allowed into Gaza.
Yeah.
If you're a journalist, you'll probably get killed. The IDF will probably kill you. So we don't get to see the scenes, the atrocities, and the horrors of what's going on in Gaza, like we could see with Vietnam. But again, the whole system, our First Amendment is free press, free speech, right? So any attempt to censor or restrict what the press can do or report on is unconstitutional. Absolutely. And I think that those who impose that need to be, to me, the leaders that we elect are supposed to be defending. They take an oath to defend the Constitution. Well, how about American people rising up and saying, we are going to hold you to your oath, or you're going to get out of here? Now, this can lead us into some further future discussions we're going to have about how the pyramid of political power in America got turned upside down, because this is important for people to understand, because they don't understand, because government-run schools are not teaching true history anymore, right? We're getting this fabricated narrative that is only partially true, but specific and important things that we need to understand historically when we ask the question, how did we get here?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you have no context of what went on, World War I and the Treaty of Versailles and how that led to World War II and how World War II led to the rise of the national security state, if you don't know about the Progressive Era and that horrible year of 1913 that saw the government take control of the money supply through the Federal Reserve Act, it became for the first time that the federal government could now go into the pocketbooks and bank accounts of individual citizens through the 16th Amendment, how the states were defanged with the 17th Amendment that took away the power of the states to choose their own senators by whatever means they wanted through the state legislators, legislative bodies. The justification was, okay, we're going to become more democratic. But what they were really doing was that the Senate had been created for a very specific idea in mind, in that the Senate was going to be insulated from the kinds of pressures that the representatives would be. So every 2 years, representatives have to go out and run for re-election, right? So how do they do it? Well, they have to raise money. They have to make promises. There's pressures from all directions on them. And basically what we have now is a system of bribery.
Yep.
And the way the Senate was set up with only re-elections every 6 years, and they weren't even elections. What you had was the state governments, the state legislative bodies would choose their senators. And they were chosen on the basis of these two senators are going to go to Washington, and their primary function is to protect the prerogatives and priorities of the states. When that was taken away, now the state legislatures became defanged. They were rendered impotent, because now they had no real control over the Senate anymore. The senators are out there raising, you look at some of the senatorial campaigns now, and they're raising tens of millions of dollars. Well, that's completely subverted the original idea. See, the checks and balances was designed to make it clear that the primacy of political power flowed from the states to the federal government, not the other way around.
Yeah.
But we're not taught any of this, so I'm hoping you and I can have more in-depth discussions about these very matters.
We will.
Yeah, because this needs to be talked about, and there's a whole younger generation out there that I think needs to be exposed to these kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
Because they're not getting it in public education.
They're not, and I'll kind of end us off with this idea that I had a friend explain to me the other day, and I thought it was a powerful analogy. There was a study done in the mid-2000s, and they had 2 colonies of ants, and they put them in, I think it was about this size, a container this size on a table, and they put them over here, and they put them over here, and they came in, and they walked past each other, and they just started building their own colonies, peacefully, doing their own things in their own space. And then after they had started building for a while, they then started shaking all of this and turning it around, mixing up all the dirt, mixing up all these ants. And then all ants started to fight. It started to erupt into chaos. And the ants were like, okay, well, it's being shaken up. It must be this other colony of ants. It must be these other people, other ants in here that are with us. Yet there was somebody shaking up the cage the whole time. And people today are distracted by the enemy that is whatever side of political discussion or whatever side of it, the other side of your opinion, when it's really a cage being shaken up. And your institutions are not serving you. They're not helping you think and be more perceptive about what is going on in your world and in your environment. So I found it to be very, very interesting because we're being shaken,
Yeah.
and we shouldn't be pointing at each other. We should be looking at what's shaking us.
Yeah. And what they're doing is essentially they're manufacturing enemies. Because why? Because that exacerbates their power, the authoritarian centralized power, which is the complete opposite or anathema of America, which is about dispersed power.
Yep.
The power of the community, the power of the family, ultimately the power of the individual. And the way we're going to restore that, I think, is that there's a lot of young people now that are kind of floundering, not having any kind of philosophical or historical context to understand what's happening now. And I think we have the means to somewhat remedy that.
I think we do.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Randall.
Thank you, Beckett.
We'll do this again soon.
Let's do.